It's a supremely good example of craftsmanship, of somebody who really can handle the writing and the writing codes, as it were. Ending, it's a complex story, ending in an incredible revelation. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today, a prime example of unreliability in fiction. Patrick McGrath novel from 1989, The Grotesque it is called. Patrick McGrath is a well-established English writer who wrote about 10 novels so far. So The Grotesque from 1989, Spider a year later in 1990, Martha Peak in 2000, Trauma in 2008. And I think at least 2 or 3 of his books have been adapted for the screen, either for the small or the large screen. I cannot quite remember. Now, Patrick McGrath in this novel gives us a narrator whose situation is so particular that it makes him unreliable, and he plays with that unreliability. That is, it is not simply a device to show off his technical skills, or quite simply to put us a little bit in a difficult situation in terms of understanding what's going on. No, it's quite clear. But at the same time, we can never be quite certain that what we understand is what happens, or whether what happens is in fact what happens. And that is the beauty of that novel. So the premise is in a way brilliant, and yet at the same time relatively simple. We're in England towards the end of the 19th century. And our narrator starts off immediately by telling us in which condition he is. He is in a very bad condition physically, because he is in a wheelchair. He cannot move any of his limbs. He can't even move his head on his own, or his eyes. He certainly cannot speak. And he cannot communicate anything with the outside world. Now remember, we're at the end of the 19th century, so the idea that he may have full awareness and consciousness in such a body is kind of alien to the times. And what that means really is that everyone around him thinks that he is brain dead, basically. That he is a vegetable, he is just a body with certain bodily functions that continue to work, but for the rest there is simply nobody home, there is nobody in his head. And yet, of course, he is fully conscious, fully aware, and that's what he tells us about. So the narration is undertaken by a relatively special type of narrator, who is fully conscious, of course, of the fact that everybody thinks he's brain dead, while at the same time being fully aware of his own abilities, which remain basically untouched, intellectually speaking. Now, what that really means also in terms of the narrative construction is that he has access to 2 sources of information, really. The ones from his field of vision, that is when he is situated in his chair looking at a room, for example, he sees exactly what is in his field of vision, but he doesn't, of course, he cannot turn his head to see more. If he hears noise behind him, he is completely incapable of checking where it comes from. The second source of information he has is, of course, his hearing. His hearing is perfectly fine, and so he hears everything, which is, again, within, of course, hearing range of him. What that means is that sometimes his chair is placed facing the wall, and so he can only see the wall, but he can hear what happens, or what is being said behind him. And of course, when he is put in a position where he can see actually what's going on, then he has the 2 sources of information at once. What is very interesting here, you can see immediately, is that from a writing point of view, and of course a reading point of view, it means that when he hears snatches in conversation behind him, that is the only thing he has. He cannot hear anything else, he cannot check who's speaking if he has a doubt. And so we have to understand here immediately that the information he has is in itself partial. Not only because it only comes from him, but because he himself has only access to partial information. He doesn't have the whole picture at all times. nor can he check on whichever bit of information he may want to know more about. So that's a beautiful sort of narrator, quite simply because there is no omniscient narrator, there is no intervention from the author in the text. What we get is solely coming from this narrator, wheelchair bound and dead to the world. Nothing else. So, who do we have? Well, that's the second aspect, which is very interesting. Patrick McGrath here didn't take any random character and focused on this unreliability or on this situation, which in itself is interesting enough, but no, he gives us a very good, very interesting narrator as well. He's an amateur scientist, the likes of which England saw many in the 19th century and certainly towards the end of the 19th century, which is basically well-born aristocrats, typically, with time on their hands and an inquisitive mind, and so they dabbled in science. And that's exactly what our narrator is. He is a dabbler in science, meaning that he never studied formally the science he's interested in at university, but he's dedicated his life to that passion, that scientific passion, and that is paleontology, that is the study of dinosaurs. And so for decades ago really, 20, 30 years ago perhaps at the time of narration, he discovered the skeleton of a dinosaur. And he's been working on this skeleton since. So he has a sort of barn in on his estate near his house, and there is a skeleton, and he's been trying to understand the skeleton, and more to the point, he's been trying to prove and to convince academia, the world of universities, he's been trying to convince them that he has found a proof of a link between the dinosaurs and the birds. This is, of course, doubly ironic here, because basically this proof that he wants to bring of that link between birds and dinosaurs at the time did not yet exist. It was not yet out there in the zeitgeist, as it were. And so, of course, in the book, in the novel, he is derided, he is kept at a distance, kept at bay by academia, because in academia this theory doesn't exist and they certainly do not believe in it, and they see it as a sign of a deranged amateur who simply doesn't really know what he's talking about, and he is trying to play at the scientist and being a scientist, but he isn't really, and he doesn't belong in that world. In fact, it's doubly ironic because we know now that birds are indeed the descendants of dinosaurs, but at the time, again, it was not well known. This typical figure of let's say aristocrat or at least a rich, wealthy person playing at being a scientist, you know at least one example of it, and that's of course in Jules Verne, Around the World in 80 Days. I cannot now remember the name of the main character, unfortunately, but I'm sure you know it, and he is one of those people that doesn't really need to work, and he has enough money to have a laboratory in his garden and experiments and machines that he constructs and everything. Now, in addition to being a paleontologist, real or supposed, he also is a very, very, very difficult man, and that's what comes through in his narrative, that is, he has realized during his normal life that he was not an easy man. And yet he remained a difficult man. So on his estate, he lives with his wife and his daughter. So relationship between him and his wife are very distant and very difficult. And his daughter has suffered a mental breakdown, and she's not quite right, or at least she doesn't seem to be quite right. She seems to be a bit crazy, really. She seems to have gone crazy. And yet we will get some hints in the novel that perhaps it is not the case, or perhaps it is the case. It's unclear because the only information we get is from her father, who, again, I remind you, can only see and hear very partially, and for the rest cannot interact with anybody at all. So what happens here really is that the narrative is leading towards the day he had a stroke that put him in that wheelchair and in that condition. Before the stroke is that basically very busy man, a lover of sports, of hunting, of horse riding, of roaming his estate, of being close to nature, and he keeps going on and on, not in a boring way at all, but that's one of the highlights of his personality, really. He loves being active and doing things, and he has a number of servants as well, some of whom work on the estate as gardeners, for example, types of gardeners. And these are people he knows, some of them at least, he knows from his time in the army, because he also was, of course, an officer in the army when he was much younger. And that's about the extent of the people around him. And so he tells us his life, up until the moment he had a stroke. And we understand, because he keeps saying in the novel, I will tell you, you will find out. And so the moment where we are given the explanation of the stroke is being postponed. Very well done, actually. And the thing really is that the stroke is, of course, the major event in his life in many ways, because it put him in that wheelchair. But at the same time, we are beginning to suspect that the cause of the stroke, or perhaps the causes of the stroke, are more important in some ways than the stroke itself. Or at least that it is vital to understand the reasons for the stroke and not simply accept that he had a stroke. Because there are reasons for it. And one of the reasons, for example, is, well, his daughter was supposed to marry a man. And that man came to the house many times. And that man suddenly disappeared. Couldn't find him anywhere. So people suspected that perhaps he had gone, afraid of marriage perhaps, or whichever other reason. But actually, well, he is found. And the state he's in when he's found begs a great question. Well, what happened? Now you must understand here, of course, that this kind of mystery is going on in the background, what happened to the future son-in-law, at the same time as the main narrator, the only narrator, is trying to sort of understand himself the situation he's in. Now, because he has very partial information, and because he's a very difficult person, very antisocial type of person, it also means that he has a tendency to interpret things in a certain way. And so, of course, as a reader, immediately we start suspecting that perhaps his way of interpreting things, facts, events, words, is not the only one, and is it the right one? But of course he is a prisoner of his own personality in that sense, and so the way he reads the world, and certainly the way he reads the relationship between his wife and his butler, is colored by not only his anti-sociability, but also ultimately his lack of information when he reflects on it now that he is in a wheelchair. And so he becomes convinced, basically, that the butler is after his estate and also his wife. And it's beautifully done. The way, and it has to be said many times probably, the way the author here, McGrath, handles this constant doubting that we have and this constant questioning, and yet at the same time giving us hints that are we right? Are we wrong? Is he right? Is he wrong? Is absolutely masterful. It's a wonderful example of craftsmanship, of somebody really making use of writing techniques and beauty of the ambivalence of language and descriptions to make us doubt all the time. So basically what we have here is, in the beginning, a pretty simple situation. Something happened, he's in his wheelchair, he's going to tell you about his life, but it turns out that his life is not as straightforward as it seemed, and then there's this story emerging about his daughter and her fiancé, and the disappearance of said fiancé, and then there's this guy on the estate also, this sort of gardener, husbander, I'm not sure it's the right word, but a guy, taking care of the estates and the animals and all this in it. He's a bit of a shady figure, isn't he? He's a bit of a weird. Does he play a role, perhaps? Does he have anything to bring to the story? Maybe we find at some stage that he does have a role, and perhaps he has something else to him that is also important to know in order to understand the main narrator. And that basically will bring you to a final revelation, which is, I would suggest, very difficult to come to on your own throughout the novel. I may be wrong, and maybe somebody will have an idea. I had an intimation maybe 2/3 in. I thought, oh, perhaps it's this, but it's also because I know a little bit about those circles in the 19th century. But otherwise, I think it's so well handled throughout the novel that it's very, very difficult to suspect what happens at the end. And the beauty here is that what happens at the end is as much a revelation for us or to us as it is to him. And that, again, is absolutely wonderfully, masterfully handled, because we understand that he is unreliable, not because he wants to lie to us, and not because he's a mean person who only wants to say half-truth or complete lies. No. He's unreliable because, essentially, he's lying to himself. And that is, of course, why this book works so well. So really, that brings us to the sort of only point I want to bring here in terms of literary technique, as it were. Unreliability in a narrator is very often presented as a way to make the reader understand that completeness of information is better than partial access to information, and that when we have a narrator who's unreliable, then, of course, it immediately means that we should doubt the very concept of knowing, of proof. How do we know? Is it an interpretation? Is it a real thing? Etc., etc. Well, that's all very fine, but I mean, here we have an example of how unreliability can be used as a creative tool. And it is not really, I don't think, at all a question for McGrath here, the writer, to encourage us to think about the ontological status of narrators or characters, or how much do we know in the world, do we ever know anything? It might be, but it seems to be that the novel is interested in other things, and so it's using unreliability as a way to, as an instrument for. This is important, of course, because when you think a little bit about all the books you've read which had an unreliable narrator in them, then you realize that some of them were unreliable because they wanted to lie actively. There's this Nigel Williams novel from the 80s, I can't remember the title now, but I'm sure I'll find it, where the guy says on page 1, my job is to lie, so don't expect the truth from me. But that's an extreme case. You can be unreliable because you had a stroke, which is not the case here. You can be unreliable because your understanding of the world makes you unreliable. The butler in Ishiguro, The Remains of the Day, is world-class example of that, of course, wonderful example of that. You can be unreliable because you lost your mind, because you forgot, because you're afraid, because you had a shock, or because you don't understand. And these are all ways of being unreliable. And of course, the reasons for the unreliability of a narrator is usually much more interesting to know about and to think about than the unreliability itself, which is interesting enough, but very limited in that sense. If you think about why a narrator is unreliable, and therefore what it means about what he says, and the doubt it sows in your mind, and that is much more fruitful as a reader, I think, than simply hang on to the idea that, oh, it's unreliable, so that's all about the truth, and is truth real? It's a bit too abstract, perhaps, when you read. So, in conclusion, really, Pat McGrath here has written a wonderful novel. It reads very well. It's very funny in many ways. There are many ironic comments because the personality of the narrator is so antisocial and, in a way, aggressive and independent and fiery and fierce. He has some very good lines, and of course the contrast with the people around him is also very interesting. The premise itself makes this a great book. Again, he's fully aware of what's going on with him, and it tortures him, but at the same time he's a prisoner of his own head, so that's what we get from him. It's, again, relatively short book, but it provokes a whole lot of tiny questions. It's a supremely good example of craftsmanship, of somebody who really can handle the writing and the writing codes, as it were, and the tricks of writing, perhaps. And it's also a mystery. It's a detective story almost, where the detective is both a narrator and you really, not in the Agatha Christie sense, you want to know who killed whom, because your mind is working along with his, and it might be that your interpretation of what he says or what he sees is completely different from his, and so of course you're also trying to find out what happened and who he is and what's all that stuff about, including the dinosaurs, of course. And again, it's a wonderful example of, on the surface, just a normal story, light and funny, and actually ending, it's a complex story, ending in an incredible revelation in some ways. And that revelation in itself says a lot, I think, about the character in return. Beautiful novel, wonderful novel. You have a great time reading it. Whichever reason you have, if not interested in all that literary stuff, it's a wonderful, delightful novel to read, and a great reward at the end, I hope. So I can only wish you the best of time reading that novel. If you like this video, of course, many thanks for liking, subscribing, and I'll see you on the next one.